Sup nerds! So last time you saw this slightly dirty white wall, you were probably watching a video about this guy, the Dingoo A330. We talked extensively about it and what a cool handheld it was, but in it I did also mention that there was a device that they put out after this one called the Dingoo A330. And of course, today we're gonna talk about that one. But it's not such a simple topic to talk about because you see, first we'll have to take a look at the history of the Dingoo. As I mentioned in the previous video, the Dingoo A330 was very popular, a lot of people liked it, and yet it had its shortcomings of course, since it was one of the earliest emulation handhelds. Though of course a lot of it was fixed through software updates, but after 1.2, suddenly the updates stopped. Months passed and people wondered what happened, even their official site was taken down, leaving many people to wonder what had happened. That started a wave of conspiracy theories in the forums back then. What a time to be alive it was. But one of the conspiracy theories was that they were bankrupt, and another that the team behind Dingoo had a falling out with their parent company. Now, which one is true? We will never really know. But a few years later, the Dingoo A330 did come out. As you can see, the form factor kind of resembled that of a PSP, and people didn't really like that. They did like the blockiness of the Dingoo A320, and with this, it felt like a sort of a soulless copy, wanting to be something that it was not. Especially because, as I told you in the previous video, the modded PSP was a huge contender to the Dingoo, and a better one at that. So seeing the next device of the Dingoo trying to look like a PSP, it didn't really bode well with people. Not only that, but it did have a few different things. The shoulder buttons actually did look like shoulder buttons, but as you can see, they were still very clicky. They were really hard clicks. They were transparent though, and it did say L and R there, which was a very nice touch, but it didn't feel great pressing them. Of course, it was worlds better than what we had in the Dingoo A320. It was worlds better than this, but still, it wasn't really liked by people either. The face buttons were a bit more pronounced than the original ones, which was something a lot of people complained about, so pressing them did feel better, but not by much, because when you press them, they did sink in quite a bit, so the feel, though better, not too much better. Likewise, the D-pad did feel very similar, but it was slightly pronounced at the edges, so that it did feel better than before. Likewise, the select and start buttons were also slightly more pronounced. That said, they're just as clicky as before. And another change that they did make was the speakers were on the back now. I don't know if you can tell, but there were these two lines of holes there and two lines of hole here, which were the speakers. I guess the idea with it was that the sound would hit your palm and travel up your arm. That said, this was a very small device, so not many people cupped their hands to play this, but rather played it with their fingers like this, and a lot of the times people with bigger hands, their fingers did end up plugging the speaker holes, making them not be able to hear much. So people did not like that change. They did prefer the speakers being at the bottom. That was decent and didn't need to be changed. Aside from that, the bottom is much the same. As you can see, it still used the mini USB and the mini SD slot. Of course, I don't have anything here. And there is, of course, the AV out for the TV. And the A330, like the A320, had the headphone jack here on the right, and the power switch thing that you had to hold to turn on was largely the same, which people didn't really enjoy. They didn't really have a problem with it, but it was just holding it to turn on, didn't really feel that great. Now you can see that there were slight bumps in the back. I guess that was their attempt at having slightly better ergonomics. That said, like I said, this is a tiny device, much like the original A320, so it didn't really change anything, because like I said, people mostly played with their fingers like this, so it made no difference. It was just awkward. The plastic as well wasn't much smoother plastic that, as you can see, did get the finger stains on pretty easily, making it pretty gross, but I think people didn't mind it back then. But if you remember when I showed you the back of my A320, my A320 was made here in Brazil because Dynacom did get the license for it. That said, this A330 was made in China, No A330s were made here in Brazil, and hence people had to import them here. That said, this logo right here sparked a new wave. All of those conspiracy theories again. Why? Because if you remember, the logo of the Dingoo in A320 was that of a paw, not of whatever this is. Even though they kept the name of Dingoo and kept form factor, something about it did feel different. Now I do have two A330s. One was fairly brand new and one had a screen issue, so I did have two to mess around. At my younger age, I guess I did think I could fix this, which I didn't, but I do have two of them to sort of show. Don't remember if this turned on without a cable. Yeah, I think the battery on this one is shot as well, so I won't be able to show that. But fret not, I do have the working A330, and as you can see, it does a Dingoo technology, and that logo was different. Despite that, of course, the stock firmware inside was much the same, very familiar to that of A320. Not only that, all of these conspiracy theories, of course, went into an overdrive when soon after, another device came out called the Dingoo A330. Now, it had the same numbering of A330, but this one was not Dingoo, it was Dingoo. And this is an interesting device. The form factor is very similar to the other two, but they actually answered all of the complaints that people had with the A320, but also with the Dingoo A330 coming out a little later. They did have the benefit to address all that. The buttons did feel much better, as you can see, with the little indent on the middle, which a lot of the classic handhelds had this, and this made a huge difference when pressing them. Not only that, but the buttons itself felt much better. The plastic itself felt much better. The select and start were slightly clicky, not as clicky as the Dingoo A330, and definitely not as pronounced, so it was better to press them. The D-pad also, you can see they did have that circular indent there as well, and it did feel much better. You could definitely feel the ball in the middle for you to move around on the D-pad. On the A330, you didn't really feel the ball. If you pressed the middle, you did feel it sink in, and you did not feel it. So, it was kind of awkward to press it. Not too bad, but still definitely not as good as the Dingoo's one. And not only that, but the shoulder buttons. They weren't clicky, they were fairly smushy, but not too much. It was pretty good, though if you see, it did have this little wobbliness to it, but no matter, it did feel much better than what this was. It did also keep a lanyard hole on there because people did like that on the Dingoo A330. That said, if you see, the speakers of the A320 were back. Not only that, but they did also move around things a little bit. They still used a mini USB slot on the bottom, but if you look up here, the mini USB port was moved to the top with the AV out as well, but also the headphone jack moved from the side to the top, which people did like it better because having the headphone jack on the side to play while having it connected did not feel that great. Nobody liked that. Nobody, and they were pretty mad that they kept it in the same place here. So people were angry, but Dingoo did address that and put it on top, making this way more popular than the other two. And there was, of course, the whole button for the reset. I'm not sure where the mic is on this one, because on the other two, of course, there was the reset button on the side and the mic hole side by side. And I'm not sure where the mic is on this, but I do know that there was a mic on here. I just don't remember where they put it. Not only so, but the weird holding switch to turn on was gone, and instead, just a normal switch where you just had to flick once to turn on and flick down to turn off. But here is the thing. Dingoo MPS trademarked. Yeah, this is what I wanted to show you. The conspiracy theories went haywire when they noticed that the Game used that logo, which was the original Dingoo company's logo, making people wonder if the conspiracy theory regarding the team behind the A320 having a fallout with your parent company being true, because the Game A330 did not keep the name Dingoo, but they did keep their logo, which is pretty interesting. Of course, they never confirmed anything for us, so we'll again never really know. But we do know that both were called A330, and they were somehow, all three of them, related. For the most part, everything else was the same. The firmware on this was different, as you can tell, slightly different, even though the firmware on the A330 was very similar to the A330. On the Game A330 it was slightly different, and the performance in games was also fairly different. Now when I go to the game, you can see that there is a glitch there. Did you see that? There is a glitch there once in a while, and so I cannot boot games from this anymore, even though just a few months ago I did play Wario Land 4 on this. So yeah, it is pretty sad, but it is what it is. You can see like there is this little glitches, and then that's when it freezes, I think. Oh, it's sort of going. Let's try Lofi and see if they do boot up. I think it froze. Yeah, this is what happened when I was testing out before for this video as well. And I'm not sure what happened. I don't think I ever dropped this, but seeing the graphical glitches on there and the delay on controls, it does make me think that perhaps something inside did get slightly detached or something like that. I could open it at some point to check it out, but I just figured I would bring this out to make the comparison to the Dingoo A330, which I think is pretty interesting. But yeah, it froze, so sadly I won't be able to show you the difference in performance and stuff. I do have two of it as well, but one was given to me already bricked, and I did try to unbrick it in hopes that it would work, but alas, I could not unbrick it way back then. I spent many a nights with people on Dingoonity forums, and we never could really figure out how to unbrick this. And I think we made it even worse because it doesn't even turn on anymore. When it worked, it was much better than the other two. I did like them quite a bit. The form factor, it did feel much nicer. You can see that it is slightly wider, not by much, but just slightly wider than both, and fatter. It did just feel much better. The plastic quality felt much better. It just, out of the three, this was definitely my favorite. Sadly, it's not working. But as for the A330, the sadness did not stop there, because though it was a device that came after the A320 and it was made to be its successor, they didn't change much. The chipset was still the Ingenic, the screen was supposedly better, but the description that they put in it was something ridiculous like 16 million colors. And that made people think that perhaps they were exaggerating at least just a little bit. That said, the RAM on this was bigger. On the A320, it was 32 megabytes, and people did complain that it was too little. With the Dingoo A330, they did double it to a whopping 64 megabytes, which of course, even back then it wasn't that great, but still, double the RAM, double the performance. That said, it did help out quite a bit. Not only so, but on the box and on the advertisements they did say that it did have a wireless function on it, and people wondered if that meant Wi-Fi, but it wasn't. What it did, there was a bundle that came with a wireless controller that could only connect to the Dingoo A330, and likewise, the Dingoo A330 could only recognize that specific controller. So it was pretty weird, especially because the controller itself was not really that great, but it was a choice that they made. And sadly, though the firmware was updated a little bit, eventually this too was abandoned. So if you do see some of the forums that are still alive talking about the Dingoo, you see a lot of firmware updates for the Dingoo A320 and the Dingoo A380, which is the next device. Sadly, I don't have that one. This is where we're gonna stop showing with the Dingoos, but the A330 did not get a lot of firmware updates. and it was just practically abandoned, making it so that no firmware that it had for it actually took advantage of the 64 megabytes. Which is pretty ridiculous to think about, but some of the emulators did take advantage of it. It's just that the firmware itself would not. So loading times, booting time, stuff like that did not get affected by the RAM at all. The Dingoo A330 did also have 64 megabyte RAM to it, but like I said, their firmware was different, and so theirs did make use of the larger RAM. Not only so, but they also advertised this with a wireless function, but instead of weird controller connection, having two Dingoo A330s at a certain proximity level, they could connect to one another to make use of local co-op in some of the games and emulators that did support it. So that was fantastic, and possibly the very first emulation handheld that did something like this. There was a lot to like about the Dingoo A330, which made people love the Dingoo A330 much more than the Dingoo A330. Though of course, even the Dingoo, they did eventually abandon the A330, and I'm not sure what happened after that, but Dingoo did come out with the A380 and the A320E. So the Dingoo A380 did have the form factor of the A320, but with better buttons, a slightly better Ingenic chip, and a 64 megabyte RAM. But that said, a lot of people felt like it was the Dingoo company who just grabbed the innards of the A330 and put it in the carcasses of the A320, because a lot of what people wanted them to fix on the A330 was not fixed, like the headphone jack on the side and the power switch on the side. Those were not changed. Of course, the speakers went back to the two at the bottom, but that's how it was with the A320, which is why people imagine they just reused the carcass of the A320. Despite this lack of improvements, because the A380 was what kept receiving the updates for years to come, it did become one of the more popular handhelds compared to the other two A330 devices. And Dingoo just kinda fizzled out, was never heard from again. Some people theorized that they spent too much money on the Dingoo A330, which was a mostly obscure handheld at that point, especially because people were confused at the fact that there were two A330 devices. A lot of people did just decide to go with the Dingoo because it was a familiar name, and so many people thought that the Dingoo did go bankrupt from spending too much money on a device that didn't see much sale. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. And perhaps we never will. Now that's it for the history lesson of these intriguing Chinese emulation handhelds. So with that said, let's go to testing some of the games. I won't talk about all the stuff that it can do because I did talk about it all in the A320 video, and it's much the same. Like I said, the firmware practically didn't change. Now you could install the Open Dingux on this as well. That said, you did need the dual boot files specific to the A330, which I couldn't find. So I can't show you putting Dingux on it and testing the Dingux on it. If someone out there does have the files, then maybe you could share it with me and we could try it out at some point. But yeah, for now, I don't have them, so I will only be showing you the stock firmware. Though maybe you saw when I did turn this on, it did say Dingux on it. That's how I received this device. I was not the first owner of it, however, so I was always under the impression that the guy who sold me this did install Dingux on it. But when I tried to boot it holding select and all these other buttons that I tried, it did not boot into Open Dingux. So I'm not too sure what is up with that or what was done to this. So yeah, I did try to do a clean install, but I couldn't find the A330 specific files. That said, if you go into the emulator files, you can see that they do have a lot more emulators than on the A320 stock firmware. You can see that they had Atari, Game Gear, Mega Drive, Master System, Odyssey, and even Neo Geo, which we didn't have on the A320. They even have Super Nintendo showing, which if you remember, on the A320 they did not show Super Nintendo. But if you go into the Mini SD, I do have other ROMs in there. You can see Game Boy Advance, Color, and Classic were there. The Neo Geo was here. I can show you Neo Geo. It actually runs quite decent. There is Metal Slug 2. And it's actually pretty cool that it did run Neo Geo pretty great, because Neo Geo is one of those consoles that when we were growing up, it was really, really cool, right? You can see that the sound was a little awkward. And there is some frame rate drops. So yeah, it wasn't perfect. For the most part, it did play pretty good. There was slight frame rate drops here and there, which the longer you play, I do feel like it does get better. Maybe it needed to like load shaders or something, I don't know. But the more I play, I do feel like there is less stutters. So yeah, we do actually have the games that we had for the Dingoo here, the 7 days and whatnot. We did try Ultimate Drift on the Dingoo A320 and it did freeze on us. So I guess we could try the Ultimate Drift here and see if it runs. Did it freeze? Oh my god, it froze. It froze even before going into the game. I'll try to turn it off. And yeah, it definitely froze. It doesn't turn on. So yeah, it is frozen. We'll just have to reset it with a paperclip as per usual. So in that sense, the A320 was better because it did at least boot into it and then froze when the game started. But here it wouldn't even start the game, which is interesting to think about. We did have Game Gear, which is fantastic. I do like Game Gear games, specifically the Mega Man game for it. I don't know if they have it here. Yes, Mega Man. This was possibly my favorite non-Mega Man X Mega Man game. Napalm, and of course, they put us in Vietnam looking place. I'm terrible at this. And there you go. But yeah, Game Gear stuff did work pretty well on here. No reason not to. It was a fantastic little handheld. I did like it quite a bit. Game Boy Advance, of course, runs great. I just wish these games ran better. This too, I did try to run the 3D game and it froze again. So I'm not sure what's going on there, but you know, it is what it is. That said, one of the things we did test on the A320 was of course Mega Man X, showing the difference between the stock firmware emulator and the Open Dingoo emulator, and of course the Open Dingoo emulator was worlds better, though it still had some frame rate issues. Now we can test it here. Now we can test it here to show you guys whether the 64 megabytes did make it better or not. I don't know if you saw the emulator thing, but that did look like a custom emulator boot screen, so I'm not too sure whether, like I said, whether the person did make modifications to this prior to selling me. I did try contacting him, but I did buy this way back in like 2014 or so. The contact number that I had for him, he did not answer. So the sound is a lot lower, but you can see that there's practically no frame rate issues. There is no frame rate drops. It does play quite well. Yeah, once we destroy this guy, you can see whether there is the frame rate issue or not, because the biggest frame rate issue on the Open Dingoo emulator that we had was when they were dropping here. And of course, as you can see, there was no frame rate drops. So, you know, fantastic. They did improve the SNES emulator a ton on this. I assume the 64 megabytes have to do with that. But like I said, if you see here, it says Pocket SNES. So I don't think this is the stock OS emulator. So it could be that it is much better because of that. I'm not too certain. But it is what it is, and it is running on stock firmware. So it is still fantastic to see that. And see if I do have Star Fox in here. I don't. I did want to try out Star Fox to see if it works on this better than on the Open Dingoo, because on the Open Dingoo it was way terrible. You guys saw that the emulator for the Super Nintendo did say Pocket SNES. I did realize that the files here says PKS instead of SFC or SMC, which is usually what the Super Nintendo ROMs are in. So I was wondering what PKS was. I did Google it. I couldn't find much on it, but I did Google the name of the emulator, Pocket SNES, because if you go into any of these, you do see their Pocket SNES. Right? And so I did Google that, and apparently it is a emulator made for another handheld, Pocket SNES by Flipster. I'm not sure if this is something that the previous owner put it in here himself, or if this actually comes with the A330. Because it is a Pocket SNES, it only reads PKS files, which I assume that's what it stands for, PKS, Pocket SNES. So I wasn't able to add the Star Fox to compare here, but on the microSD I did put the SMC files and then rename them to PKS, and then they show up. When they were just SMC, they didn't even show up. And then once I renamed them PKS, which I do realize that just renaming them probably doesn't do much. Like I mentioned, I probably had to convert it somehow to PKS officially. I don't know how to do that because I can't find anything on PKS files. If anyone knows how to, let me know in the comments down below. But yeah, Star Fox 2 doesn't even boot up. Mega Man X3 also doesn't even boot up. But Star Fox does boot up, which I thought was interesting. There you go. It does boot up, but there's no sound. It does look a lot better than on the A320 when we played, but there is a lot of graphical glitches, and then it just stops here. It doesn't go further from that. Maybe if I knew how to convert the files from SMC to PKS the right way instead of just renaming them, maybe we could play it better on this, because we do know that Mega Man X ran on this a lot better than even on the Dingoo of A320. So maybe Star Fox will run better here. Of course, we did see it a little bit laggy, but on the A320, the Star Fox game was practically unplayable. So it's just that. If you guys remember, on the stock firmware of A320, they did have, I could run SMC files, I could run Super Nintendo ROMs if they were in SMC, but I can't on this one. So I'm not too sure what is up with that. After all these years, back when I bought this, I just played the games that were already on there, or Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color games that I added myself. As you can see, if you go to the micro SD card, the stuff that was on the micro SD card, I added them myself. The Neo Geo stuff, Game Boy Advance stuff, you can see that these are my ROMs. So I usually play these, and I didn't really pay too much attention to that other stuff over there on here. I didn't pay too much attention to I did play a few games that were on here already, like game that was on the Game Gear and whatnot, things that I didn't need to download. I just played a little bit, you know, had some fun. But then things that I actually played to beat were games that I added myself, and I didn't actually ever try Super Nintendo, just because the Super Nintendo was really jank on the A320. I just assumed it would be the same, so I didn't try until now in 2025. And so just now I'm starting to realize the situation in this A330, it is a lot jankier than I originally thought it was, and there's just no way to know whether this jank was like this to begin with from factory or from the previous owner that messed around with it. Like I said, it does have the splash screen of Dingoo when we turn it on, so I do assume at least it was messed around with a little bit. So yeah, there's no way for me to know at the moment, unless someone else who owns this device can chime in for us in the comments down below. I couldn't find much about it online. And they do have stuff like borders and stuff. Yeah, so I do think that this is, though this is stock firmware, it is a slightly modified stock firmware with added stuff to it. At least that is what it feels like. I do like having these in my collection still. I do like them. I do think it's neat and all that, but you know, that's where my appreciation for it stops. I like it as a piece of history in emulation handhelds. Aside from that, it was just okay for its time and very subpar for modern times. And that is where our journey with the Dingoo handhelds come to an end. But like I said, if there is something specific you would like to see me test on these devices, whether the A330 or the A320, let me know and I can try to make a video testing those out. If not, we'll probably move on to the next emulation handheld in our collection, so stay tuned for that. Leave a like if you enjoyed this video, consider helping out the channel by clicking join down below, subscribe to see more videos like this or of other collections, usually in-game stuff. Otherwise, I'll see you next time, and until then, always nerd on.